April 12, 1945, Baguio, Philippines. 24 Japanese women knelt in the mud of a makeshift compound, their hands pressed together in prayer. They weren't praying for rescue, they were praying for death. The sky above them was the color of ash, and in the distance, American voices echoed through the morning air. Lieutenant Keiko Yamada closed her eyes and steadied her breathing. She told the others to face death with dignity, as soldiers of the Emperor should, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The propaganda films flickered through her mind. American soldiers laughing as they bayoneted prisoners. American soldiers setting villages ablaze. American soldiers who took no prisoners and gave no mercy. And then the footsteps stopped. The compound gate swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to announce the end of everything. But the Americans weren't carrying rifles. They were carrying crates. Wooden crates that smelled of something the women hadn't encountered in months. Something that would, in the next 60 seconds, shatter everything they'd believed their entire lives. That something was bacon. But to understand how 24 women came to kneel in Philippine mud, praying for a bullet that would never come, you need to step back 6 months. To October 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur fulfilled his promise and returned to the Philippines. When the Japanese garrison that had occupied these islands since 1942 found itself fighting a desperate defensive campaign, it could never win. Among the 30,000 Japanese troops scattered across Luzon were approximately 200 women. Nurses, communications officers, administrative clerks, each one trained in the ancient code that governed every Japanese soldier's soul. The Senjin-kun, the military code that stated clearly, do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. Officers carried cyanide capsules in their breast pockets. Soldiers were trained to use grenades on themselves rather than surrender. The concept of surrender was so foreign to Japanese military culture that the word itself carried connotations of ultimate disgrace of betrayal, so profound it stained not just the soldier, but their entire family line for generations. For Japanese women in uniform, the stakes were even higher. They'd been shown the films, they'd heard the broadcasts, they knew what American soldiers did to female captives. Or at least they thought they knew. If you're finding value in these untold chapters of history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, whether it's Tokyo, Texas, or anywhere in between. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive, because what you're about to hear isn't just about war. It's about the power of truth when it confronts propaganda, about humanity that persists even in the darkest hours, and about how a simple breakfast can change everything. By March 1945, as American forces pushed into the mountainous Baguio region, the Japanese defensive perimeter collapsed like a house of cards in a typhoon. Most Japanese troops retreated into the mountains to wage guerrilla warfare, but approximately 24 women found themselves cut off from the main force, abandoned in the chaos of retreat. Among them was Sergeant Reiko Tanaka, 31 years old, a surgical nurse from a small village outside Hiroshima. She'd served in Manila before deployment to Baguio, had treated wounded soldiers, had seen the brutality of war up close. Now she kept a diary, writing in careful characters by whatever light she could find. A diary that would decades later become one of the few surviving records of what happened in those terrible weeks. There was Lieutenant Keiko Yamada, 28, the highest-ranking officer among them. She'd been an English teacher in Tokyo before the war, had even studied for a semester in Seattle. She carried that cyanide capsule in her pocket, felt its weight every moment. She'd been engaged before the war. Her fiancé had died at Midway, and she'd volunteered for military service the day after receiving the news. Private First Class Hana Ito was the youngest at 19. A farm girl from rural Kyushu who joined the military to support her family. She still believed the emperor was divine, still thought of war in the simple terms of good versus evil. She'd never seen combat, had worked as an administrative clerk, filing reports and typing correspondence. Now she was about to experience something that would shatter her innocence forever. And there was Corporal Akemisato, 26, who managed logistics and supplies for what the military euphemistically called comfort stations. She hadn't been a comfort woman herself, but she'd seen what the system did to those who were. She was harder than the others, more cynical, a survivor who'd learned to do what was necessary. She'd lost her brother to a bonsai charge at Saipan, had stopped believing in honor the day she learned officers had ordered that charge while staying safely behind. For 3 weeks, these 24 women survived in conditions that would have broken most soldiers. The first week they hid in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Baguio. They foraged for food, tree bark, insects, water from streams they knew was contaminated, but drank anyway because thirst was a more immediate enemy than dysentery. Akemi proved the most resourceful. She knew which insects were edible, which plants wouldn't kill them, how to find water by watching birds. The others looked to her with a mix of gratitude and resentment. Survival skills weren't supposed to matter for those who'd been taught that death was preferable to capture. Corporal Fumiko Matsuda, 29, a nurse who'd left 3 young children with her mother when she deployed, developed a high fever from an infected wound on her leg. At night, they listened to American patrols getting closer. The sound of boots on gravel, the casual laughter of men who'd already won, who were just cleaning up the remnants of a defeated army. Lieutenant Keiko maintained military routine despite its futility. Roll call every morning, inspection of their pitiful supplies, orders given and followed as if they were still soldiers with purpose, rather than ghosts waiting to fade. She didn't know what else to do. Structure was all she had left. The second week they moved to a cave system deeper in the mountains. Fumiko's fever worsened into pneumonia. She'd lie there at night calling out for her children in her delirium. The others would try to comfort her, but what comfort was there? They had no medicine, no clean water, no hope of rescue. Their rations dwindled to a handful of rice per person per day. Then less than that, then nothing. It was during the second week that they first discussed the suicide pact. Not openly at first, just hints, suggestions. The kind of conversation that happens in whispers when death seems like the only dignified option left. Some of the women carried razor blades. Others had saved morphine from medical supplies. Keiko had her cyanide capsule. They could die as soldiers. They could avoid what was coming. Reiko wrote in her diary, her hands shaking from hunger and fever. Tomorrow they will find us. Tomorrow it ends. I try to remember my daughter's face, but hunger makes memory difficult. Perhaps that's mercy. Better she forgets me too, rather than know I died in shame. The third week brought desperation so acute it felt like a physical presence in the cave. Fumiko was delirious more often than lucid, her body consuming itself from the inside out. 2 other women were too weak to stand. The sound of American patrols was constant now, a mechanical inevitability like the tide. That's when Hana did something either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both. She crept to an American supply dump one night and managed to steal a bag of rations. Rice, some canned goods, precious supplies they devoured like starving animals. But the theft meant the Americans knew they were there, knew exactly where to look. The active hunting had begun. On April 1st, everything ended, not with violence, but with exhaustion. Hana collapsed during a water run. She simply fell, her malnourished body finally giving out after 3 weeks of survival on the edge of death. When she woke, she was surrounded by American soldiers. She screamed. It was a scream that brought the other women running straight into what they thought was an ambush. But it wasn't an ambush at all. Private First Class David Kimura, 22 years old, born in Seattle to Japanese immigrant parents, called out in perfect Japanese, "We won't hurt you. You need medical help." The women didn't believe him. How could they? They'd been taught their entire military lives that Americans were beasts in human form, that capture meant torture and death. They thought this was the trick, the moment before the violence began. Lieutenant Keiko gave the order. She'd been trained for this moment, had rehearsed it in her mind 1,000 times. She ordered everyone to close their eyes and prepare for the end. They knelt there in the dirt surrounded by armed American soldiers and began reciting a death poem together. David Kimura stood there listening, and something in his chest tightened. He'd grown up in America, had been sent to an internment camp with his family after Pearl Harbor, had volunteered for military service to prove his loyalty. He understood both sides of this moment in a way few others could. He recognized what the women were doing. "They're not asking for mercy," he said quietly. "They're asking it to be swift." Webb was a career soldier, had served in 3 campaigns before this one, had seen his share of combat and death. But he'd never seen enemy soldiers who were this terrified of surrender. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, "they're terrified of us." The women didn't resist. They didn't fight. They didn't try to run. They simply knelt and waited for the inevitable with whatever dignity, starvation, and fear had left them. Fumiko was too sick to stand. Hana was crying silently, tears streaming down her face but making no sound. Reiko held the hands of the younger women, providing what comfort she could in what she thought were their final moments. The Americans loaded them onto trucks like precious cargo, handling them, gently speaking in soft tones that the women couldn't understand and wouldn't have believed anyway. They were driven to a temporary detention facility outside Baguio. Not a traditional prisoner of war camp, just a fenced perimeter with 4 military tents, a water source guard posts at the corners. The 33rd Infantry Division soldiers rotating guard duty had no training in handling female prisoners. Most had never seen a Japanese woman soldier. Their standing orders were simple: secure the perimeter, prevent escape, maintain basic humanitarian standards as outlined in the Geneva Convention. But those orders said nothing about what to do when prisoners refused to eat because they believed the food was poisoned. For the first 3 days, the women barely touched their rations. They were given rice porridge twice daily, occasionally supplemented with dried fish. They'd look at the food with hollow eyes, then at each other, then back at the food. Some ate tiny amounts only when near starvation. Others waited to see if the first eaters died before trying themselves. It was torture of a kind the Americans hadn't intended. The women were convinced this was part of the game, that the Americans were fattening them before the real suffering began. Each meal became a test of will, a negotiation between hunger and fear. Reiko watched Fumiko deteriorate. The pneumonia was killing her, and they had no medicine, no way to help. She watched this woman who'd been a colleague, a friend, waste away in front of her eyes. The moral calculus was impossible. Let her die with what they'd been taught was honor, or beg the enemy for medicine, and betray everything they'd been trained to believe: pride versus survival, dignity versus desperate need. On the 5th day, dysentery spread through the compound. Contaminated water from their weeks in the jungle, combined with weakened immune systems, created a medical crisis. 6 women became violently ill. The compound had no infirmary, just buckets for waste. The humiliation compounded the suffering in ways that made death seem merciful. Hana, the youngest, reached her breaking point. She began crying uncontrollably, curled up in a corner of their tent. "Why don't they just kill us?" she sobbed. "Why make us suffer like this?" Akemi, the hardened survivor, tried to comfort her. But even Akemi's cynicism was failing her. "Maybe this is the torture," she said quietly. "Slow death. Maybe they want to watch us waste away." That night, Reiko made her decision. She approached the fence where David Kimura stood guard. It took her 10 minutes to work up the courage to speak. 10 minutes of standing there in silence, wrestling with 3 years of conditioning that said talking to the enemy was betrayal. Finally, she spoke in Japanese. "My friend is dying. Do you have medicine?" David translated for the benefit of the other guards, then responded in Japanese. "Yes, we have sulfa drugs. We can help." "Why?" Reiko's voice was barely a whisper. "Why help us?" "Because you're sick. Because that's what decent people do." Reiko stared at him, trying to reconcile this response with everything she'd been taught. "You want something. Information betrayal." "No, we just want you to not die." "I don't understand." "I know," David said gently, "but maybe you will." Within an hour, medicine arrived. Army Medic Corporal James Cole, 28 years old, from rural Ohio, entered the compound carrying a medical bag. The women shrank back in terror. They'd been taught that American medics were particularly sadistic, that they experimented on prisoners, that medical care was just another form of torture. Cole slowly approached Fumiko, showing empty hands, moving like someone trying not to startle a wounded animal. Through David's translation, he explained what he was going to do: examine her, listen to her lungs, administer an injection that would help with the infection. The other women watched in disbelief as this enemy soldier knelt beside their dying friend and began a careful professional examination. He was gentle, respectful. His hands were steady and sure, the hands of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. When he administered the sulfa drug injection, he explained each step through David's translation. "She should feel better in 48 hours, Cole said, packing up his medical bag. He looked at Reiko, made eye contact. "You're a good nurse. You kept her alive this long." Reiko didn't know how to respond. This wasn't supposed to happen. The enemy wasn't supposed to be professional, respectful, gentle. The enemy was supposed to be savage. But the greatest shock was yet to come. That would arrive on April 12th in the form of a man who'd been a history teacher before the war, taught him that textbooks and reality rarely aligned. Captain William Morrison was 34 years old, though the war had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. He'd taught high school history in a small town in Oregon, had coached the debate team, had believed in the power of understanding multiple perspectives. He'd been married to Sarah for 8 years. They had two daughters, Emily, who was 8, and Grace, who was 5. He carried their photo in his breast pocket right where Japanese officers carried cyanide capsules. Morrison had landed at Leyte Gulf in October 1904. He'd fought his way north through some of the bloodiest combat in the Pacific Theater. He'd seen his best friend die at Ormoc, had watched good men torn apart by artillery at ranges so close he could hear their last words. He'd seen what Japanese forces had done to Filipino civilians in Manila, had found evidence of torture inflicted on American prisoners of war. The war had taught him to hate, to compartmentalize, to see the enemy as enemy and nothing more because anything else would make the killing impossible. But he'd never quite managed to kill the teacher inside him. The part that believed in human complexity, that understood propaganda, shaped perception, that knew history was written by people who were themselves trapped in moments they didn't fully understand. On the morning of April 12th, Morrison visited the detention compound as part of a routine division inspection. It was supposed to be quick. Check the perimeter security, verify the prisoner count, ensure compliance with standing orders. 10 minutes, then back to the real work of war. But what he saw stopped him cold. 24 women who looked like they'd already died inside. Hollow eyes, skeletal frames, sitting in mud, barely eating. Just waiting for an end they thought was inevitable. These weren't soldiers. They were human beings destroyed by fear so profound it had broken something fundamental in their souls. David Kimura approached him, saluted. "Sir, permission to explain the situation." Morrison nodded, his eyes never leaving the women. "Sir, they think we're holding them for execution. They think the meager rations are deliberate cruelty before torture. They're waiting for us to start hurting them." "How long have they believed this?" "Their whole lives, sir. It's what they were taught, what their propaganda told them. They can't conceive of surrender that doesn't end in torture and death." Morrison stood there in the morning sun, feeling something crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. These weren't the Japanese soldiers who'd killed his men. These were women who'd been lied to so completely they couldn't recognize mercy when it was offered. What kind of government did that to its own people? What kind of military trained soldiers to fear survival more than death? He thought about his daughters back in Oregon, about Sarah, who always saw the good in people, who'd married a history teacher because she believed understanding the past could help build a better future. What would she say if she could see this moment? Would she recognize the man he'd become? Morrison turned to his supply sergeant. "Get me breakfast." The sergeant looked confused. "Sir, get me breakfast, real breakfast, everything we've got." "Sir, for the prisoners." "Yes, bacon, eggs, if we have them, bread, coffee, fruit, whatever we'd eat." "Sir, that's officer rations. We'd need authorization." Morrison's voice was quiet but carried the weight of command. "I'm authorizing it. Get it done." 1 hour later, soldiers returned with crates from the division's supply depot. Not military rations, real food, American abundance packed in wooden boxes. The smell arrived first, fresh bread still warm from the bakery trucks that followed American forces wherever they advanced, bacon frying in cast iron pans over camp stoves, coffee brewing in large metal percolators, canned fruit that smelled of syrup in summer. These were smells the women hadn't experienced in months, smells that didn't exist in Japan anymore, where cities were being firebombed and food was rationed to the edge of starvation. Smells of a different world, a world of abundance so complete it could afford to feed its enemies. The women stared in disbelief. Was this another torture? A psychological game designed to break them before the physical suffering began? They'd been trained to expect every form of cruelty, but this cruelty of hope might be the worst of all. Reiko stood first. Always Reiko, the nurse, the one who'd made the choice to ask for medicine, who'd already crossed one line and found the world didn't end. She walked slowly to the crates like someone approaching something holy or cursed, uncertain which. She picked up a can of corned beef, examined it, turned it over in her hands, reading the English labels she couldn't fully understand. Then she looked at Captain Morrison with a question in her eyes that needed no translation. David Kimura spoke in Japanese. She's asking if it's poisoned. Morrison took the can from Reiko's hands. He opened it with his knife, the metal lid peeling back with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. He took a fork, ate a bite of the corned beef, chewed slowly, swallowed. Then he handed the can back to her. "Tell her it's real," Morrison said quietly. "Tell her they're not going to die today." Reiko's hands shook as she took the can back. She looked at the food, at Morrison, at the other women watching. Then she took a small bite. Salt, meat, protein her body had been craving for weeks. Real food. She began crying. The dam broke. The other women surged forward, not frantically, but with careful, deliberate movements, like people who'd learned not to trust good things. They took food slowly, as if it might vanish if they moved too quickly or wanted it too much. Hana picked up a chocolate bar, held it in both hands like a sacred relic. "America no chocoreto," she whispered. American chocolate. She'd heard about it in propaganda broadcasts, always described as poisoned or drugged. But here it was real and solid, wrapped in paper printed with English words. Akemi grabbed bread, tore into it with her hands, ate like the starving animal she'd become. Then she stopped, suddenly aware of her own lack of dignity, of how far they'd all fallen. But no one was watching her with judgment. Everyone was too busy experiencing their own private miracles. Keiko took a cup of coffee, held it to her nose, let the steam rise around her face. She remembered Seattle before the war, the cafe near the university where she'd studied English, the taste of American coffee that was so different from Japanese tea. She remembered believing in a future where such small cultural exchanges mattered, where understanding between nations was possible. She took a sip and tasted civilization. Fumiko was too weak to stand. Reiko brought food to her, knelt beside her, fed her like a child. Small bites. Careful. Patient. This woman who'd been dying, who'd been calling for her children in fever dreams, ate real food for the first time in weeks. The American soldiers watched. Some cried openly. Corporal Thomas Rivera from San Antonio stood there with tears streaming down his face. "I've never seen anything like this," he said to no one in particular. Private Eddie Walsh from Boston struggled with conflicting emotions. "They're still the enemy," he muttered. "They killed Bobby at Manila. They bayoneted prisoners at Bataan." But his voice carried no conviction. It was hard to hate someone who cried over bread. David Kimura understood both sides better than anyone. He'd grown up American, been sent to a camp because his face looked like the enemy, volunteered to fight to prove loyalty that should never have been questioned. He watched these Japanese women discover that Americans could be kind, and he watched American soldiers discover that Japanese soldiers could be human. "War's terrible like that," he said quietly. "It makes enemies out of people who might have been friends." Morrison watched it all, knowing he'd crossed some invisible line. He couldn't unsee their humanity now, couldn't reduce them to enemies or strategic objectives or acceptable casualties. They were people. That was inconvenient for a war that required seeing them as anything but. When the initial feeding frenzy subsided, when the women had eaten enough to remember they were human beings, with feelings beyond hunger, Reiko approached Morrison. She bowed deeply, formally, in the traditional Japanese manner that conveyed profound respect and gratitude. "Arigato gozaimasu," she said. "Thank you." Morrison awkwardly returned the bow, uncertain of the protocol. He'd read about Japanese customs in his history texts, but books didn't prepare you for moments like this. For the weight of genuine gratitude from someone who'd expected death and received breakfast instead. No common language was needed. Gratitude transcended propaganda. In that moment, in that muddy compound outside Baguio, two people from opposite sides of a brutal war recognized each other as human. It was a small thing. It wouldn't stop the war or save lives or change the fundamental fact that nations were locked in mortal combat. But it was something. A crack in the absolute certainties that total war demanded. A glimpse of the world as it actually was, not as propaganda painted it. They'd been taught to expect brutality. But brutal captors don't bring breakfast. Monsters don't hire translators who speak your language. Monsters don't send medics to heal their enemies' wounds. And that truth would prove more dangerous to everything they believed than any bullet ever could. The breakfast changed something fundamental in the compound, but trust is a delicate thing, far more fragile than fear. Over the following 3 weeks, something extraordinary began to take root in that muddy perimeter outside Baguio. Not friendship. The gulf was too wide for that. But something more significant: recognition, the slow, painful acknowledgement that the enemy was human. On the first day after the breakfast, medical supplies arrived in quantities that seemed absurd for 24 prisoners. Sulfa drugs, bandages, disinfectant, clean cotton for dressings. Corporal James Cole set up a makeshift infirmary in one of the tents, organizing supplies with the methodical care of someone who'd learned medicine in the chaos of combat. Fumiko's pneumonia began responding to treatment. The rattle in her chest that had sounded like death's approach started to ease. Dysentery was controlled with clean water and medicine. Canvas cots replaced the muddy ground. A proper latrine was dug with privacy screens, restoring a dignity the women had lost somewhere in those 3 weeks of survival. But the psychological wounds ran deeper than any infection. The women still flinched when guards approached. They still expected betrayal at every turn. They couldn't reconcile 3 years of propaganda with 3 days of kindness. Holding two contradictory truths in your mind was physically painful, like feeling your brain tear itself apart, trying to reconcile impossible realities. Lieutenant Keiko struggled with it most. She'd been trained as an officer, conditioned to lead, to maintain discipline, to uphold the emperor's honor. But what was honor when your enemy fed you? What was discipline when your own military had abandoned you to die? She'd spent 3 years believing Americans were beasts who showed no mercy to prisoners. Now those monsters were treating her wounds and teaching her English words for medical supplies. On the third day after the breakfast, David Kimura offered to teach basic English lessons. Captain Morrison suggested the women could teach Japanese in return. It was a small thing, this language exchange, but it represented something revolutionary. You don't learn someone's language if you plan to kill them. Language is hope. Language is future tense. Hana volunteered first. At 19, she was the youngest, the least hardened by war and ideology. She pointed at the sky and said, "Sora." David repeated, "Sky." "Is Kai." Hana tried her tongue, struggling with the unfamiliar sound. "Close, sky. The Y sound is different." "Sky." And then she smiled. It was the first time any of the women had smiled since capture, maybe since long before that. A small thing, a smile over a single word, but it represented a future where communication was possible. That same day, they faced a practical problem that required cooperation. The latrine needed to be moved for sanitation purposes. Morrison made a decision that shocked everyone. "We'll dig together," he said through David's translation. The concept was revolutionary. Captors and prisoners working side by side, sharing labor, sharing sweat. Lieutenant Keiko approved the women helping. It gave them purpose, dignity, a sense of contributing rather than simply existing. They were soldiers after all, trained to work, to be useful. Sitting idle had been its own form of torture. Corporal Rivera found himself digging next to Akemi. He taught her English words for tools: shovel, bucket, dirt. She taught him Japanese: supedo, baketsu, tsuchi. They worked in silence, punctuated by these small exchanges, finding humanity in manual labor and muddy hands. The medical cooperation deepened. Reiko was a trained surgical nurse with years of experience. Corporal Cole needed help with patients and recognized competence when he saw it. They began working together, communicating through David's translation, at first, then developing their own shorthand of gestures and medical terminology that transcended language. One afternoon, Cole needed to drain an infected wound on a woman's leg. It would be painful, require someone to hold the patient's hand, provide comfort during the procedure. He asked Reiko through David, "Can you hold her hand? It helps if someone they trust is there." Reiko was surprised by the gentleness in his voice, by the fact that he understood comfort mattered, that psychological care was part of healing. She translated to the patient, then held her hand while Cole worked. He was skilled but kind, explaining each step, apologizing when it hurt, making sure the patient understood what was happening and why. When it was over, Cole looked at Reiko with professional respect. "You're a good nurse." "You are a good doctor," Reiko replied in halting English. "Just a corporal. Learn it in the field." Reiko nodded slowly. Sometimes field is best teacher. She understood that better than most. War taught lessons that no classroom could match, though the tuition was paid in blood and trauma. These small moments accumulated like compound interest, each one building on the last. Language lessons, shared labor, medical cooperation. The walls between captor and prisoner didn't crumble dramatically. They eroded slowly, worn down by daily contact and grudging acknowledgement of shared humanity. Then came the afternoon that changed everything again. Late afternoon, the 21st of April, a sudden tropical downpour turned the sky black and sent everyone scrambling for shelter. Rain in the Philippines doesn't arrive gently. It comes like a fist turning the world into water and noise. Hana ended up under a supply tarp with 3 American soldiers. It happened by accident, by proximity, by the simple fact that the tarp was closest when the sky opened up. They sat there in awkward silence at first. The rain pounded above them with a sound like continuous artillery. Water streamed off the edges of the tarp, creating a curtain that separated them from the rest of the world. Someone passed around a pack of Lucky Strikes. Smoking was one of those universal soldier behaviors that transcended nationality. If you had cigarettes, you shared them. It was protocol older than any military regulation. For 20 minutes, they just sat there, listening to rain, smoking in silence. 4 people who'd been trained to kill each other, sharing shelter from a storm that didn't care about politics or propaganda or which side of history they'd been born on. Then Private Danny O'Brien, 21 years old, a farm boy from Iowa, asked David to translate a question. "Does it rain like this in Japan?" Hana considered the question. "Yes, in summer, monsoon season, very strong rain." O'Brien nodded. "We get big storms in Iowa too. Not like this, but big. The corn needs it." "Your family has farm?" "Yeah, corn and soybeans mostly. My dad wanted me to stay work the farm, but I wanted to see the world." He laughed without humor. "Be careful what you wish for, I guess." Hana understood the sentiment even before David translated it fully. "My family also farm, rice, small farm in Kyushu." They talked about seasons and planting and the way weather dictated life when you worked the land. Simple conversation about simple things. The kind of talk that happened in every farming community, in every country in the world. Shared human experience that had nothing to do with war. When the rain finally slowed, when the drumming on the tarp faded to a patter and then to silence, Hana looked at the American soldiers. She spoke in careful English, pronouncing each word with concentration. "Same rain, same sky." O'Brien met her eyes and nodded slowly. "Yeah, same rain." Everyone sat with that truth for a moment. The geography was different, the languages were different, the flags they served were different. But the rain fell on everyone equally. Nature didn't care about nationalism. The sky belonged to no nation. It was a small moment easily forgotten in the larger arc of history. But it represented something monumental. A crack in the absolute certainties that war demanded. A glimpse of the world as it actually was, not as propaganda painted it. These moments were multiplying throughout the compound. But not everyone believed in mercy. Not everyone thought feeding the enemy was the path to victory. And one man from Alabama was about to test just how far Captain Morrison's commitment to humanity could stretch. Sergeant Roy Brennan arrived at the compound on April 28th, reassigned from another unit due to personnel shortages. He was 38 years old and looked older. Guadalcanal had aged him. Tarawa had hardened him. Peleliu had broken something inside him that would never heal. At Peleliu, Brennan had lost his entire squad. 12 men, his brothers in everything but blood. He'd watched them die in ways that haunted his sleep and poisoned his waking hours. Japanese soldiers had fought to the death in that coral nightmare, had used wounded Marines as bait, had shown no mercy, and expected none in return. Brennan had learned to hate with a purity that felt almost religious. The only good Japanese soldier was a dead one. That wasn't prejudice, that was mathematics. That was survival. That was the truth written in the blood of better men than he'd ever be. When he saw the compound, saw American soldiers sharing cigarettes with Japanese prisoners, saw food being given to women who would have killed any of them, given the chance, something inside him recoiled. He found Captain Morrison in the command tent, asked permission to speak freely, which in military terms meant he was about to say something insubordinate and wanted the formality of permission to soften it. "Granted," Morrison said, looking up from paperwork. "This is horseshit, sir. With all due respect, we're feeding the enemy. Men are dying on Okinawa right now. Good American boys bleeding out in the mud, and we're serving these women bacon and eggs like they're at a diner back home." Morrison's voice stayed level. "They're prisoners of war, Sergeant. Geneva Convention requires us to treat them humanely." The Geneva Convention. Brennan's laugh was bitter. You weren't at Palelu, sir. You didn't see what they did to our wounded. They used them as bait, set them up in the open crying for help, and when Marines tried to save them, they opened fire. They don't deserve breakfast. They deserve exactly what they gave our boys. That's not who we are, Sergeant. Maybe that's who we should be. Only way to win this war is to be harder than they are, meaner, more willing to do what's necessary. Morrison stood slowly. He was shorter than Brennan, but in that moment seemed to fill more space. I've seen what the Japanese did in Manila. I found the bodies. I know what they're capable of. But these women didn't do that. They're pawns in a game they didn't choose to play. And if we become like the worst of them, what exactly did we fight for? We fought for America, sir. For our guys, not for the enemy's comfort. No, we fought for the idea that some things matter more than winning. That civilization means something. That we can be better than our worst impulses. Morrison paused. You're dismissed, Sergeant. I understand your feelings. I share some of them. But the answer isn't more cruelty. It's remembering we're human. Brennan saluted, but his eyes held contempt. Yes, sir. If you say so, sir. He left the tent carrying his hatred like a loaded weapon. Over the next few days, Brennan made his presence felt. He refused to speak to the prisoners, made threatening gestures when he thought Morrison wasn't watching, kicked over a water bucket and claimed it was an accident. Other soldiers watched to see who they'd follow, the compassionate officer or the vengeful sergeant, mercy or justice, civilization or survival. The women noticed immediately. They'd developed an instinct for danger over 3 weeks in the jungle and 3 weeks in the compound. Keiko told the others through gestures and whispered conversations that the new guard wanted them dead, that he was waiting for permission or opportunity, whichever came first. Fear returned to the compound like an old infection flaring up. Progress threatened to unravel. Trust proved as fragile as they'd feared. On the evening of May 3rd, everything came to a head. 2 women, a chemi, and another had crawled under the fence to retrieve medical supplies that had blown away in the wind, not escaping, just retrieving bandages that had scattered when a supply box tipped over. But Brennan was on guard duty, and when he saw movement outside the fence after dark instinct and hatred took over. Escape attempt, his voice cut through the evening air like a gunshot. He raised his rifle, chambering around with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. The 2 women froze, hands full of bandages, realizing too late how this looked, how it would always look. Enemy prisoners outside the fence at night. The narrative wrote itself. Should have done this weeks ago, Brennan muttered, sighting down the barrel. Keiko heard the commotion, heard the fear in Akemi's voice as she tried to explain in Japanese that no one understood. Lieutenant Keiko had spent 3 weeks learning that Americans could be kind, but she'd also learned that some truths transcended nationality. Leadership meant protecting your people. Honor meant standing between them and death, even when death wore a friendly flag. She stepped between Brennan's rifle and the 2 women. No escape, she said in careful English, each word pronounced with concentration. Get medicine, see? She pointed at the bandages scattered on the ground, visible in the compound lights. Brennan's rifle didn't waver. You're a liar. All Japs are liars. Get out of the way. Keiko stood firm. It took every ounce of courage she possessed, standing in front of a loaded weapon held by a man who wanted her dead. But this was honor. Not the propaganda version that glorified death. Real honor that meant protecting those under your command, even from your captors. Shoot me if must, Keiko said quietly, but they tell truth. The moment stretched, Brennan's finger on the trigger. Keiko standing straight, despite the trembling in her legs. The 2 women behind her frozen in terror. Other prisoners and guards emerging from tents drawn by the commotion. Then Captain Morrison's voice cut through the tension. Sergeant Brennan, stand down. Morrison had been in his tent reviewing reports when he heard the shouting. Now he walked toward the scene with the measured pace of someone who knew running would escalate things. Stand down, Sergeant. That's an order. Sir, they were escaping. I caught them outside the fence. I can see bandages in their hands, Sergeant. Medical supplies that blew away in the wind earlier. I authorized retrieval. They weren't escaping. They were following orders. Sir, you're too soft on them. They're playing you. They're the enemy, and you're treating them like guests. And you're letting hatred blind you to reality. Morrison's voice hardened. Final warning, Sergeant. Stand down. The standoff lasted another 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. Brennan could mutiny, could shoot, could let years of accumulated rage override military discipline. His finger tightened on the trigger. David Kimura spoke quietly in Japanese to the two women. Move away from the fence slowly. Show your hands are empty except for the bandages. Don't make sudden moves. They obeyed, walking backward with exaggerated care, hands held high. Akemi was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. David spoke to Brennan in English, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent his whole life translating between worlds that didn't want to understand each other. Sergeant, she's 26. She lost her brother at Saipan. She manages supplies. She was getting bandages, that's all. Just bandages. Something in Brennan's face shifted. Not softening exactly, but the absolute certainty wavered. He lowered his rifle slowly, reluctantly, like a man putting down something precious. This is wrong, sir, he said to Morrison. This is why we'll lose. We won't lose, Sergeant, and we won't win by becoming what we're fighting against. Brennan walked away, rifle slung over his shoulder, carrying his hatred intact. Morrison watched him go, knowing he had won this confrontation, but not the larger battle. There would always be more Brennans. More men who'd seen too much suffered, too much lost, too much to ever forgive. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. The women who'd begun to trust retreated into fear. Progress reset. That night, they huddled together in their tent, unable to sleep, wondering if the next guard would be Morrison or Brennan, mercy or vengeance. Reiko wrote in her diary, "We were fools to hope. Kindness is not policy, it's personality, and personalities change with the guard rotation." Morrison reassigned Brennan to different duties, but the damage was done. Trust once broken was harder to rebuild than walls. The women watched every guard now, trying to determine which type of American they were dealing with, the ones who brought breakfast or the ones who brought rifles. But Morrison wasn't finished. If anything, the incident with Brennan hardened his resolve. He'd seen what hatred looked like, and he'd seen what it created. He chose a different path, understanding that small gestures could rebuild what violence had broken. Over the next week, he implemented what he called systematic humanization, though he never used that term. He just did things that seemed obvious to a former teacher who believed in the power of ordinary interactions to change minds. He organized shared labor details, not as punishment, but as cooperation. When the latrine needed moving, Americans and Japanese dug together. When supplies needed organizing, they worked side by side. Language became less important than shared effort and muddy hands. He encouraged more language exchanges. David held daily lessons. The women taught Japanese calligraphy, showing American soldiers how to write their names in characters that looked like art. The soldiers taught card games, shared cigarettes, showed photos of families back home. Keiko found herself discussing logistics with Morrison through David's translation. Where to dig drainage ditches, how to organize sleeping areas for better ventilation. Practical matters that required no ideology, only common sense and experience. She realized she was using her officer training, applying her organizational skills. She was being treated as a professional, not a prisoner. One afternoon, Morrison organized what he called a cultural exchange meal. The women cooked Japanese dishes using American supplies, improvising with what was available. Rice balls made with Spam, miso soup with canned vegetables. It wasn't authentic, but it was an attempt at connection through food, that most universal language. They invited the American soldiers to eat. Some declined. Brennan and others like him refused to participate in what they saw as fraternization with the enemy. But others came. Rivera, Walsh, O'Brien, Cole. They sat in a circle with the Japanese women and ate improvised Japanese food and tried to pronounce the names of dishes they couldn't quite taste correctly, but appreciated anyway. "Tastes like home," Hannah said in English, tears in her eyes. "Yeah," Walsh admitted, surprising himself. "Kinda does." Stories began flowing in those shared meals. Akemi told about her brother's death at Saipan, about bonsai charges ordered by officers who stayed safely behind. About the day she stopped believing in honor and started believing in survival. The Americans listened in silence, recognizing the waste they'd seen on their own side. Bad orders, pointless deaths, leadership failures that cost good people their lives. Morrison shared his own story. Teaching history, believing in learning from the past, then being thrown into war, and discovering that textbook knowledge meant nothing when artillery was falling. I used to teach about World War I, he said through David's translation. Told my students it was the war to end all wars. They believed me. I believed me. And here we are doing it again. Keiko responded in halting English. Perhaps third time we learn. Morrison smiled sadly. God, I hope so. I really do. The question of honor haunted Keiko more than the others. She'd been trained as an officer. Duty, honor, sacrifice. The Senjin Kun code that said death before dishonor. But what was honor now? Her government had lied. Her officers had abandoned them. Her enemies had shown more honor than her own commanders. Late one night, she discussed it with Reiko in whispered Japanese in their tent. What are we now? We surrendered. We serve it. We're not soldiers anymore. We're alive, Reiko replied simply. But are we honorable? Is honor dying in the mud, or is honor living to tell the truth? The truth that we were wrong, the truth that we were lied to. There's a difference, Reiko paused. I have a daughter, 6 years old. When I go home, do I tell her I died for a lie, or do I tell her I survived to teach her truth? Which is more honorable? Keiko had no answer. The question would haunt her for decades. On May 6th, orders arrived that would end this strange interlude. The women were being transferred to a permanent POW facility in Manila. Better equipped, proper medical care, organizational structure. Morrison's unit was moving north for the final push toward Japan. The compound would be dismantled. The community that had formed fragile and strange and unprecedented would dissolve. Morrison gathered the women to explain through David's translation. Manila, safety, medical care. Eventually, when the war ended, repatriation to Japan. He tried to make it sound positive, like an improvement, and in material terms it was. But the women's reaction surprised him. Not joy at leaving, but sadness at parting. These Americans who'd been their captors had become something else. Not friends, the gulf was still too wide for that, but fellow humans who'd seen each other clearly. Reiko spoke for all of them. Will you be there in Manila? Morrison shook his head. No, my unit is moving out. Different direction. The silence carried weight. After everything, they were just ships passing. Lives intersecting briefly in the chaos of war, then diverging towards separate horizons. Then we say goodbye, Reiko said quietly. That evening, the women requested permission to thank the Americans properly. Morrison approved, curious what form proper thanks would take. The women arranged a formal ceremony using what little they had. They lined up, all 24 of them, facing the American soldiers who'd guarded them, fed them, healed them. And they bowed, deeply formally in the traditional Japanese manner that conveyed profound respect and gratitude. They held the bow for a long time, longer than Morrison had ever seen. It was a gesture that carried weight, that meant something in Japanese culture he couldn't fully grasp but could feel. The Americans stood awkwardly, uncertain how to respond. Morrison returned the bow, feeling clumsy, doing it knowing his form was wrong, but hoping the intention came through. The other soldiers followed his lead. Corporal Rivera was crying again, tears streaming down his face without shame. David Kimura understood the depth of what had just happened. For Japanese military women, to bow to enemy soldiers was enormous, unprecedented. It acknowledged debt beyond words. It recognized humanity beyond nationalism. Morrison spoke and David translated with careful precision. You deserve to be treated like human beings. I'm glad we could do that much. I hope when you go home, you'll remember that not all Americans are monsters. Just like I'll remember that not all Japanese are monsters. We're just people caught in something bigger than us. Keiko responded in English, wanting Morrison to hear the words directly. You showed us everything we were told was wrong. That is greatest gift, greater than food, greater than medicine. You gave us truth. We will never forget. Personal farewells followed. Reiko and Corporal Cole exchanged small gifts. She gave him an origami crane folded from paper she'd saved. He gave her a St. Christopher medal his mother had sent him. For safe travels, he said. She nodded, not knowing who St. did. Christopher was but understanding the gesture. Hannah and Private O'Brien exchanged addresses written carefully on scraps of paper. A hope that after the war, if the world ever made sense again, they might write letters, might maintain a connection forged in mud and rain and shared humanity. Akemi shook hands with Corporal Rivera Western style. "You good man," she said in English. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Morrison and Keiko faced each other last. She extended her hand Western style, a gesture that meant something. He shook it, feeling the strength in her grip despite malnutrition and weeks of suffering. "Thank you for letting us live," Keiko said. "Thank you for reminding me why we fight," Morrison replied. "Not to destroy, to make something better. Perhaps next time we meet not as enemies." "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." The trucks came at dawn on May 7th to take them to Manila. As they drove away, the women looked back at the compound one last time. It had been a prison, but it had also been the place where they learned the most dangerous truth of all, that everything they'd been taught to believe was a lie, that enemies could be teachers, that humanity persisted even when propaganda said it couldn't, that the world was more complicated and more hopeful than any government wanted its soldiers to know. And that truth would be harder to carry home than any wound of war. The Manila POW facility was everything the Baguio compound wasn't: organized and institutional, proper, barracks instead of tents, a real infirmary with medical equipment, organized mess halls, a chain of command that extended beyond one history teacher, making decisions that contradicted his training. The women arrived on May 12, 1945, and were processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Names recorded, medical examinations conducted, assigned to barracks housing several dozen other Japanese prisoners, both military and civilian. Everything was better equipped, more humane by official standards, but something essential was lost in the transition. The intimacy of the small compound was gone. The daily interactions that had humanized both sides were replaced by institutional routine. Guards rotated on regular schedules. You never saw the same American face long enough to learn their name, let alone their story. The connection between individual human beings was severed by the very efficiency that made the facility function. The facility held hundreds of Japanese prisoners now. The 24 women from Baguio found themselves among strangers who'd had different experiences, who didn't understand what had happened in that muddy compound, who looked at them with suspicion when they spoke about Americans with anything other than hatred. Some of the other prisoners had been treated brutally, had been beaten, starved beyond what the Baguio women experienced, subjected to interrogations that left psychological scars. When Keiko's group talked about Americans who'd brought breakfast, who'd treated wounds, who'd shared cigarettes, the others reacted with disbelief or disgust. "You were brainwashed," one woman said flatly. "They played with your minds, made you think kindness was real so you'd cooperate. They're making you collaborators," another hissed. "You ate their food, learned their language. You betrayed the emperor." Keiko's group found themselves isolated even among fellow Japanese, too contaminated by kindness to be trusted, too compromised by survival to maintain proper shame. They clustered together in their corner of the barracks, a small island of shared experience in a sea of judgment. The psychological aftermath manifested differently in each woman. Fumiko's pneumonia had been cured physically, but her mind remained sick. She had nightmares where the Americans were exactly as monstrous as the propaganda had promised. She'd dream of torture, of violence, of everything that hadn't happened, but that she'd been trained to expect. Then she'd wake up confused, uncertain which memory was real. The kindness or the horror. Both felt equally impossible. An Army psychiatrist, Captain Eleanor Hayes, 34 years old from Philadelphia, interviewed the women as part of standard processing. Her notes preserved in military archives documented what she called severe cognitive dissonance. These women's experiences contradict everything their military conditioning taught them to believe. They're experiencing a form of psychological whiplash. Reality and training are at war inside their minds, and reality is losing because it seems less plausible than propaganda. Lieutenant Keiko faced a different crisis: identity. She'd defined herself as an officer of the Imperial Army for 3 years. But what did that mean now? Her army had abandoned her. Her country was losing. The enemy had shown more honor than her own commanders. Who was she without that identity? What was an officer who no longer believed in the cause she'd been commissioned to serve? She spent hours in the facility's small library, reading whatever books were available in Japanese. There weren't many. Some Chinese classics, a few pre-war novels. She read them over and over, trying to reconstruct a sense of self from the fragments of her shattered worldview. She wrote in a journal she'd started in Manila, practicing the English she'd learned. I was taught that dying for emperor was ultimate honor. But Morrison taught me that living with integrity might be harder, might be true honor. I don't know who I am anymore, but perhaps that's the first step to becoming someone real instead of someone manufactured by propaganda. Hana adapted most easily. At 19, she was the least conditioned, the most flexible. She'd been a soldier for less than a year before capture, hadn't had time to fully internalize all the propaganda. She befriended some of the civilian women prisoners, continued learning English, even started teaching Japanese to some of the American nurses who worked in the infirmary. She was building something new from the ruins of what had been, not discarding her past, but integrating it with a possible future. She carried O'Brien's address in her pocket like a talisman, a physical proof that connection across enemy lines was possible. Reiko became the unofficial counselor for their group. Other women came to her with fears and questions they couldn't articulate. She'd read sections of her diary from the Baguio days. Remember how afraid we were. Remember how certain we were that Americans would torture us. Remember how wrong we were. It helped some of them, but not all. Some wounds went too deep for stories to heal. The facility divided informally into factions. Keiko's group, who'd experienced unexpected kindness. Others who'd been treated harshly and couldn't understand why anyone would speak well of Americans. Civilians who'd been caught in the crossfire and blamed both sides equally. The divisions created tension that occasionally erupted into violence. After one near fight, Captain Hayes separated some of the groups for everyone's safety. You can't force healing, she told her staff. Trauma creates its own timeline. On August 15, 1945, everything changed again. The entire facility was gathered in the main yard. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners standing in the tropical heat, surrounded by American guards, wondering why they'd been assembled. Rumors had been spreading for days. Something about Russia entering the war. Something about new American bombs that destroyed entire cities in single blasts. Something about the impossible. Then the radio crackled to life, and Emperor Hirohito's voice filled the air. His voice was tinny, distant, speaking in formal, classical Japanese that many could barely understand. But the meaning was clear enough. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Surrender. Unconditional surrender. The war was over and Japan had lost. The reactions varied wildly. Some prisoners screamed no, as if volume could change reality. Some wept openly, their entire worldview collapsing in real time. Some refused to believe it, convinced this was American propaganda, that the emperor would never surrender, that this was a trick. A few prisoners attempted suicide. American guards had been warned this might happen, were positioned to intervene. They wrestled knives away, stopped women from running toward the fence, prevented what honor-bound conditioning demanded. Saving lives of people who didn't want to be saved. Sergeant Reiko stood listening to the emperor's voice, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't sure why she was crying. Relief that the killing would stop, grief at defeat, rage at the years wasted, all of it. Simultaneously, emotions too complex to separate into distinct categories. She thought of Captain Morrison and the Americans who'd fed her when she'd expected death. They'd won more than the war. They'd won the truth. They'd proven that propaganda was a lie, that enemies could be human, that honor existed in unexpected places. She thought of her daughter, now 7 years old, who probably didn't remember her mother's face. She was going home. Whatever home meant now. Whatever was left of it. Fumiko broke down completely when she heard the broadcast. She had 3 children, somewhere in Japan, if they'd survived the bombing. A husband who'd been killed in an air raid according to a Red Cross letter that had reached her weeks ago. She was going home to rebuild a life that had already been destroyed. The prospect was more terrifying than capture had been. Hana felt something unexpected. Hope. At 19, she'd known only war. Now there would be peace, whatever that meant. A chance to build something instead of just surviving. She touched O'Brien's address in her pocket and wondered if mail between America and Japan would be possible in this new world. Keiko's reaction was the most complex. The emperor had surrendered. The divine being who was supposed to be incapable of defeat had admitted defeat. Every certainty she'd been raised with had just evaporated. But instead of despair, she felt something like liberation. If the emperor could be wrong, if the divine could admit error, then maybe she could too. Maybe being wrong wasn't the ultimate shame. Maybe learning from being wrong was the path forward. The facility descended into chaos that day. American guards on high alert, unsure how prisoners would react to the news. Medical staff overwhelmed. Captain Hayes and her team working around the clock to prevent suicides and manage psychological breakdowns. That evening, Keiko's group gathered in their corner of the barracks. They sat in silence for a long time, processing what it meant. Finally, Akemi spoke. "So what now? We go home," Reiko said. "To what?" Hana asked quietly. "What's left?" Fumiko's voice was hollow. "Will they accept us? We surrendered. We survived. Those are both shameful." Keiko surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. "Then we teach them that survival isn't shameful, that what we learned matters, that Americans can be human and maybe so can we." "You think they'll listen?" Akemi's cynicism hadn't been softened by months in captivity. "Probably not at first, but we tell the truth anyway, because that's what Morrison did. He told us the truth even when it was inconvenient, even when hatred would have been easier. We owe him that much." Repatriation took months. The logistics of moving thousands of prisoners back to Japan, of processing paperwork, of arranging transportation on ships that were needed for occupation forces. The women waited in Manila through the humid summer and into fall, writing the letters home when the mail system was restored, receiving replies that told of a Japan they no longer recognized. Reiko learned her family had survived in a village outside Hiroshima, though the city itself had been obliterated by one of those new bombs. Atomic bombs, the Americans called them. Weapons that made conventional warfare obsolete and made future wars unthinkable. Her mother wrote in careful characters about devastation beyond description, about shadows burned into walls, about survival that felt like curse. Fumiko received confirmation that her children were alive with her parents in the countryside. They asked about their father in their letters, childish handwriting, asking when Daddy was coming home. She had to write back explaining death to children who'd already lost too much. The letters took weeks to compose, and she cried while writing every one. Hana's parents were alive in Kyushu. Her father wrote that the farm had survived, that they'd managed to hide enough rice from military requisitions to avoid starvation. He asked if she was well, if she'd been hurt, if she was still their daughter. She understood the question beneath the question. Had capture tainted her? Was she damaged goods? She wrote back defiantly that she was still herself, perhaps more herself than when she'd left. During the wait, Captain Hayes offered repatriation education classes, teaching the women what to expect. Japan under American occupation, MacArthur as Supreme Commander, democracy being implemented, women's rights expanding, a new constitution being written, the future arriving whether Japan was ready or not. Hana thrived in these classes. Her English improved rapidly. She learned about American democracy, about concepts like freedom of speech and equal protection that had never existed in Imperial Japan. She saw possibilities for a new Japan, one that could learn from defeat instead of being destroyed by it. Others were more resistant. Some refused to attend classes, seeing it as further brainwashing. "I won't learn from conquerors," one woman said. But Keiko's group attended faithfully. Knowledge was power. Understanding was survival. They'd learned that much in Baguio. In November 1945, transport was finally arranged. A U.S. Navy ship bound for Uraga Harbor near Tokyo. A 12-day journey across the Pacific. Mixed feelings accompanied the announcement. Joy at going home, fear of what they'd find, uncertainty about how they'd be received. The day before departure, Captain Hayes called Keiko aside for a final interview. "What will you tell people about what happened in Baguio?" Keiko considered the question carefully. "I'll tell them that the enemy taught me more about honor than my own commanders did. That kindness isn't weakness. That propaganda is the real enemy, not people on the other side of a war." Hayes nodded slowly. "That takes courage. They might not want to hear it." "Probably not, but Morrison had courage to feed us when hatred would have been easier. I can have courage to tell the truth when silence would be safer." The women boarded the ship on November 20th. Hundreds of Japanese returning home crowded into holds that smelled of salt and oil and displacement. The conditions were basic but adequate. The Americans were respectful but distant. The intimacy of Baguio was impossible to recreate at scale. During the 12-day voyage, stories circulated among the returnees. Everyone had different experiences. Some had been treated brutally in POW camps. Others had been treated fairly. A few like Keiko's group had experienced unexpected kindness. The diversity of experiences made simple narratives impossible. You couldn't say all Americans were monsters or all Americans were saviors. They were just people distributed across the moral spectrum like people everywhere. One evening, a former Navy officer who'd been harshly treated confronted Keiko. "I heard you defend the Americans, that you say they treated you well." "They did," Keiko confirmed. "I was beaten daily, starved, kept in a cage barely big enough to sit in. Your experience doesn't erase mine." "No," Keiko agreed, "and yours doesn't erase mine. Both can be true. Americans aren't one thing, neither are we. War brings out the worst and best in everyone." The officer considered this. "How do we make sense of that? How do we tell that story?" "Honestly, we tell all of it. The cruelty and the kindness. Because that's what truth looks like. It's complicated." On November 28th, the ship entered Uraga Harbor. Japan appeared on the horizon, and despite everything, despite all the ambivalence and fear, hearts lifted. Home, whatever that meant now, whatever was left of it. The devastation was visible from the ship. Buildings gone, infrastructure destroyed. People on the docks looked thin, haunted defeat written in their posture. American flags flew everywhere, a constant reminder of occupation. This was home, but not the home they'd left. The women disembarked and were processed by a combination of American and Japanese officials, given repatriation papers, told to report to local authorities, assigned to whatever remained of their home addresses, then released into a country that felt foreign. The 24 women from Baguio stood together on the dock one last time, surrounded by chaos, families reuniting, people searching for loved ones who might not exist anymore. They'd been through so much together, survived together, learned together. Now they were scattering to different corners of a broken nation. Hana had an idea. "We should meet again, 1 year from now. Same spot, whoever can make it, so we remember." They agreed, exchanging what addresses they had, making promises they weren't sure they could keep. But the intention mattered. The commitment to remember, to carry forward what they'd learned, to not let the truth get buried in the convenience of simpler narratives. They bowed to each other formally the way they'd bowed to Morrison. Then they parted ways. Reiko's journey to Hiroshima took 3 days by train, riding through a countryside that showed the scars of war everywhere. Her village on the outskirts of the city had survived, though damaged. Her family home was standing barely. Her mother looked 20 years older. Her daughter, now 7, stared at her with the eyes of a stranger. "Are you really my mama?" the child asked. Reiko's heart shattered. She'd survived war, capture, starvation, and pneumonia, but nothing prepared her for being a stranger to her own child. "Yes," she said, kneeling down. "I'm your mama, and I'm home now." Rebuilding that relationship took months. Slowly the child warmed to her. Slowly trust rebuilt. Her mother urged silence about the war. "Don't tell anyone you were captured. They'll think things." The unspoken accusation, sexual assault, collaboration, shame. But Reiko couldn't stay silent. She got work in a small clinic treating neighbors. When patients asked about the war, she told the truth. "Not everything, but enough. I was captured. Americans gave me food when I was starving, medicine when I was sick. They treated me like a human being." Some patients left disgusted by her failure to hate properly. Others listened with curiosity. One old doctor, a man in his 70s who'd practiced medicine for 50 years, heard her story and was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe that's how we rebuild. Not with weapons or pride or pretending we weren't defeated, but with honesty, with remembering that humanity exists on both sides, with teaching the next generation that enemies are just people we haven't understood yet." Reiko found her ally. Keiko's return to Tokyo was easier, in some ways harder in others. The capital was in ruins, firebombed repeatedly during the war. Her apartment building was gone. Her mother had survived, living in a shelter. Her husband, a naval officer, had also survived against odds. Their reunion was awkward. He'd fought Americans viciously in battles across the Pacific. She'd learned to see them as human. The gulf between their experiences was enormous. Their first real conversation happened a week after she returned. "Were you harmed?" He asked the question every Japanese man asked, the euphemism for rape. "No, I was treated well." He couldn't hide his disbelief. "Well, by Americans?" Yes, they fed me, healed me, respected me. That's impossible. I know how it sounds, but it's true. Her husband struggled with cognitive dissonance as profound as hers had been. You sound like you sympathize with them. I don't sympathize, I just see them as people now, as I wish they'd seen me. It took weeks of careful conversation, but slowly they found reconciliation. He finally admitted, maybe I needed to believe they were monsters, made it easier to kill them, made it possible to sleep after the things I did. And I needed to believe you were monsters, Keiko said, made it easier to accept dying for you. They both recognized they'd been pawns in a game of propaganda, both victims of governments that had taught them to hate. Finding that common ground that shared victimhood allowed them to rebuild their marriage on more honest foundations. Keiko eventually opened a small English school teaching children of the new Japan, preparing them for an occupied world where knowing English meant opportunity. She taught language, but also philosophy. Know your enemy, not to hate them, to understand them, because understanding prevents war better than weapons. Private Hana, the youngest at 19, had perhaps the hardest journey home. She'd known only war in her adult life. Her family farm in Kyushu had survived, but her parents struggled to recognize their daughter in this woman who spoke English and talked about American democracy and questioned things that were never questioned before. She couldn't go back to farming, couldn't pretend she hadn't changed. In 1946, she left home again and found work in Yokohama at American Occupation Headquarters. They needed Japanese English translators. Hana was perfect for the role. She became a bridge between worlds, helping Americans navigate Japanese culture, helping Japanese navigate American occupation. It was delicate work, often thankless, sometimes dangerous. Both sides suspected her of collaboration with the other. But she persisted because she'd learned in Baguio that bridges were necessary. She taught English classes in the evenings. When students asked where she'd learned English so well, she answered honestly. From the enemy. They taught me that enemies can become teachers, that war doesn't have to define us forever, that understanding is stronger than hatred. Some students were inspired. Others dropped her class offended by her lack of proper resentment. She accepted both reactions. Truth wasn't popular, but it was necessary. She maintained correspondence with Private O'Brien letters that took months to cross the Pacific. He wrote about returning to Iowa, taking over the family farm, struggling with nightmares and memories. She wrote about rebuilding Japan, learning to live in defeat, finding hope in small moments. Their letters built a friendship across former enemy lines, proof that connection survived even total war. Fumiko's story was the most difficult. Widowed with 3 children who barely remembered her. Trying to rebuild in a society where widows were common, but captured women were suspect. She struggled to find work, struggled with nightmares that mixed reality and propaganda until she couldn't separate them, struggled with guilt for surviving when so many hadn't. But slowly motherhood became her healing. She focused on her children, on cooking for them, clothing them, teaching them, on building routine and stability in a chaotic world. The children gradually warmed to her. Love proved its own medicine, slower than sulfa drugs, but ultimately more powerful. On November 28, 1947, 2 years after returning to Japan, 15 of the original 24 women made it back to Uriga Harbor. Some couldn't afford travel. 2 had died from illness. 7 were too ashamed or traumatized to return. But 15 came. They met at a small restaurant near the docks, pooling what little money they had for a modest meal. They looked different. 2 years of peace had added weight, softened the hardness that starvation and fear had carved into their faces. But they recognized each other immediately. The reunion was emotional. Tears and embraces and rapid conversation catching up on 2 years of survival and rebuilding. They compared notes on the Japan they were creating from the ashes of the one that had been destroyed. When the meal came, Keiko proposed a toast to survival. Everyone raised their glasses of water, unable to afford sake. Fumiko added, to the men who showed us that survival could be honorable. To second chances, Hana said quietly. Reiko finished, to remembering. So we never forget what humanity looks like even in war. Kanpai, they drank together, bonded by shared experience that no one else could fully understand. They discussed whether to tell their story publicly. Make a record of what had happened in Baguio. Write it down for history. Who would believe us? Keiko asked. Does it matter? Reiko countered. Truth is true whether people believe it or not. I think we should tell them it, Hannah said, for our children, so they know war is more complicated than heroes and villains. So they learn that understanding is possible, even after terrible conflict. I'm not ready, Fumiko admitted. Maybe I never will be. Then we wait, Keiko decided. The story will keep. Truth is patient. When the time is right, we'll tell it. But for now, we survive. We live. We raise children who know better than we did. That's enough. They agreed to meet annually, to keep the memory alive among themselves if nowhere else, to maintain the connection forged in mud and fear and unexpected breakfast. 35 years later in 1982, a historian would find them. Thomas Nakamura, a Japanese-American professor from UCLA researching forgotten stories of the Pacific War. He discovered a brief reference in military archives to Japanese women POWs treated unusually well at a compound near Baguio. Most historians had missed it or dismissed it as an anomaly, but Nakamura understood the power of anomalies. The stories that didn't fit neat narratives often revealed more truth than the ones that did. He tracked down survivors, conducted interviews, recorded their testimonies for oral history archives. Reiko, now 73, showed him her diary from 1945. Keiko, now 75, shared the journal she'd kept in Manila. Hana, 56, and running a successful translation business, spoke about building bridges. Fumiko, 76, gave the briefest interview. I'm not good at talking about this. I still can't separate what was real from what propaganda told me would happen. But I survived, and my children survived, and their children. Maybe that's the victory, not understanding it, just surviving it. Nakamura's research revealed what had happened to Captain Morrison. He'd returned to Oregon in 1946, resumed teaching history at the same high school. He rarely spoke about the war, his family said. The experience had changed him in ways he couldn't articulate. He died in 1979 at age 68, 3 years before Nakamura started his research. Morrison's daughter, Emily, now 43, granted an interview. Dad didn't talk much about the war, but once when I was in college protesting war, we argued. I said all soldiers were complicit in evil. He got quiet. Then he said something I never forgot. She paused, remembering. He said, I did one good thing in that war. I fed some women who had been taught to fear me. I showed them Americans could be decent. That's all I could do. Small gesture, but it mattered. Don't underestimate the power of small gestures of humanity in inhuman situations. Emily continued, I didn't understand then. I was young, full of righteous anger about the arms race, but now I do. He was trying to tell me that even in war, even in situations designed to dehumanize individual choices matter. That kindness is a form of resistance against propaganda and hatred. There was no medal for Captain Morrison, no commendation for feeding enemy prisoners when hatred would have been easier, no recognition for choosing humanity when inhumanity was expected. Just the memory of 24 women who'd expected death and received breakfast instead. In 1975, survivors had erected a small memorial stone in Tokyo's Peace Garden. The inscription read in both Japanese and English, to Captain William Morrison and the soldiers who showed us that humanity survives even in war's darkest hours. You fed us when we expected death. You taught us that enemies are only people we haven't understood yet. May we never forget. The final scene in Thomas Nakamura's published account captured Reiko at 70 sitting in her small house in Hiroshima, holding her old diary. He asked her the question that drove his entire research project. What do you want people to remember from your story? Reiko was silent for a long moment, looking at a photograph from the 1947 reunion. 15 women thinner than they'd been before the war, harder in some ways, softer in others. Survivors. Remember that propaganda is the first enemy we must fight, not with guns, with truth, with seeing each other as human. Morrison won something more important than military victory. He won the peace before the war even ended, because he refused to let hatred define him. Do you forgive? Nakamura asked. The war, the suffering, all of it. Reiko smiled slightly. Forgive what Morrison for feeding me or my own government for lying to me? Either, both. Forgiveness is complicated, but understanding, yes, I understand now that we were all victims of our government's propaganda. American soldiers and Japanese soldiers, all taught to hate, all given reasons to see each other as less than human. Morrison broke that cycle. That's what I'll never forget. She opened her diary to the last entry written shortly before her death in 1989 at age 77. Nakamura read it aloud years later in lectures, keeping her story alive. I am old now. Soon I will die. But before I do, I want my grandchildren to know this truth. I survived a war. I was captured by the enemy, and that enemy showed me more humanity than my own leaders. This is uncomfortable truth, complicated truth, but it is truth. The world is not divided into good people and bad people. It is divided into those who choose humanity and those who choose hatred. Morrison chose humanity. So did we eventually. That choice saved us. Remember that. Choose humanity, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard.